Are we back? David, do you know you still have music playing? Thank you. Breathe. Back in your bodies. Back on planet Earth. And thank you, Marina. That was beautiful. Just beautiful. It reminds me of the week prior to my mom's passing. All she wanted to do was hear Marina's flute music. And her room was mystical when you went in there. So that was great. Are we back? Good, 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 good. So change your story, change your life. The motto of Science of Mind, if we had a motto, the motto is change your thinking, change your life. And I've added to that, change your life, change the world. So change your thinking, change your life, change the world. And it's occurred to me as I've worked with people over many decades that our thinking doesn't just come one thought at a time. Have you noticed that? You don't just have one thought. You have a whole collection of thoughts. You have a whole series of thoughts. It may start off with one thought, but then it seems to snowball into a whole conversation or a whole story about something. So I thought rather than just settle for changing your thinking by changing one thought, let's look at the whole stories that we weave together about who we are and what life is. And I know changing stories is not terribly new. I first learned about it with John Bradshaw. And he did, you remember, go back into your self-help days? Reading all those books, he says you go back and you champion the inner child, you go and rescue the inner child, and you bring the inner child into a new environment. I remember studying a lot of Hal Stone and the psychodrama of creating different subpersonalities to kind of fix the problems that we've internalized, like have the warrior go in and get the child out of the terrible environment, or have the medicine woman there to embrace that part of us that doesn't really know what to do, or the loving grandparent to take the inner child in and nurture them back into health and wholeness. I always had dogs and ponies in those situations, since you're making it all up inside of you. And then in Science of Mind, we learned that whatever story we tell ourselves, the subconscious doesn't know the difference between our story and what happened. And what I've learned in psychology is we don't know what happened anyway. You go into the aisle in Ingalls and there's a 2-year-old on the floor screaming and kicking because they can't have all the candy in the entire candy aisle. And then the 2-year-old grows up and talks about what a terrible childhood they had and how they didn't get their needs met. And there's a very well-paid person on the other side of the couch acknowledging that and validating that sense of not getting needs met. And so this whole idea about our story and about how we can change our story, and I was well versed with all of the different ways of looking at it and all the different authors that wrote books about it. But I must say, I can't say I blame my sister, because that has a negative connotation. I make her responsible for forcing me to change my story. And I had a good story. I had a really well-rehearsed story. Some of you have heard my story. I had a story that would have some of these highly paid professionals look at me and go, oh my God, that was terrible. That was awful. I once had a therapist who looked at me, and it was one of my crowning moments in therapy. She looked at me and said, you have an indomitable spirit that you could come out of that childhood and be the person that you are today. And I went, I am indomitable. And what I realized is that my story, even though it may have been pretty factually accurate, wasn't helping me live my life. And I had great experiences as a child. I had a childhood that had so much freedom that me and my sister and my two brothers were, my sister, my brothers, and I were dropped off at the dump every Saturday morning. And my father would go off and drink, and sometime late afternoon he'd come back for us. And we did that. And I remember finding the coolest stuff at the dump. I remember building things and creating play scenarios because we were wild and free at the dump. I had a great childhood where I got to explore my neighborhood unencumbered, to where I could knock on people's doors and check them out, see if they'd let me in. And what I learned is that if one person said, "Get off my porch, get out of my yard," the next person might not. And if the next person did, the next person might not. So that I could learn how to continue to look for something that would fulfill me in my life. At that time it was, you know, a soda, a sandwich, cookie. What have you got? I'll take it. Doesn't matter. And I had all of these great experiences, but the problem with that was that I had crafted them. And I don't know if you've done this, but crafted these circumstances to come up with a position that I felt would support me in my relationships with other people. And the position that I decided on, for whatever reason, was that I had been victimized as a child. That I had been victimized by a child, that I had been neglected, that I had not been taken care of, and that I should have had better. And you know, to the outer world, people would say, well, of course. Of course you should have been fed, you should have been protected, you should have had an environment where you were not on your own at 6. You should have had that, but the problem with that is that the person I then became was the person who didn't get what she wanted. And that was the fatal flaw. Chuck, could you just flip the top switch on the thermostat from up to middle? And what my sister did, because we had a game, maybe you have siblings that you play this game with, is we would have the wasn't it awfuls. Do you remembers? Do you remember not being fed? Do you remember being locked out of the house? Do you remember what happened some of those days at the dump? Do you remember what we went through? And one day, I think I was either living in Oregon or Fort Lauderdale or something, and I saw her and I wanted to have the do you remembers again. I wanted to validate that position, that I had something lacking inside of me, that I needed sympathy from the world, and this was the reason that I wasn't the powerful being that I was supposed to be. And I looked at her and I said, do you remember? And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, she had started going to Science of Mind. I was a minister. Come on. She was far outshining me. She said, I don't know what you're talking about. I had a wonderful childhood. I had a great childhood. My childhood was fantastic. And you know, it pissed me off. Because I knew who I was with her. I was the sibling. We had that, Carolyn Mace calls it the woundology going on. My wound's bigger than your wound. No, my wound's bigger than your wound. And all of a sudden, she didn't want to play, and I had to reassess who I was. And I had to look at what my payoff was by staying small and weak. And in looking at that, I made some very important decisions in my life. I made decisions to change my story. And I know that this has not been the case all the time. There are people in this room who have heard stories about me and my past. And those stories much of those stories have stopped in more recent years. Because what I realize is it doesn't serve me and it doesn't serve you to say, look at the life that I have and I came down from the dumps. And since I came down from the dumps, you can too. Because what that does is it brings us all down to the dumps. And so what I've decided to do is just go up from here. Look at us, we're great, we all survived, we're all alive. It's not how crazy we are from our past, it's how sane we are from our past. We're doing great, let's go from here. And what I decided to do was to stop living that story. And by stop living my past, my future shifts. By creating scenarios inside of myself where I developed inner strength that I would never have gotten if I was coddled as a child, if I could come into the house when I was a child, if I was fed as a child, I would never have developed the inner strength and the self-reserves that I have today that have required me, that I have required to be able to stand up here today. I never would have gotten that. I never would have been able to trust my gut, to open up a door and to realize I needed to run. I never would have been able to say, yes, Rick and Katia Krebs are giving us land on South Bear Creek Road. We don't have a dime to our names. Let's build a center. Let's do that. That came from living a life where I had to realize that things were going to work out, that I had moxie, I had my own inner strength, and that I could have what I wanted if I was willing to be tenacious, to hold on to it, to not let other people's opinions stop me, and to never give up. But the other story kept me small. So I had to change my story. Same situations, but I had to shift the way I saw them. Instead of, that husband did me wrong. Oh, I'm such a victim. No, I'm not a victim. I picked them. Out of all the billions of people on planet Earth, I picked them. I'm not a victim. There are no victims, only volunteers. I volunteered like crazy. Every time I got married, I volunteered. So I changed my story to take the good out of it, to take the blessing out of it, to be strong from the experiences of my life, and then to set the stage for my life to reflect the strength and the blessings and the good that I was taking from my scenarios in the past. And then my mom moved up. What a surprise that was. Now, it wasn't a surprise in that I didn't know she was going to move up, but I didn't really get that she was going to come to the Center for Spiritual Living Asheville. And to stand here and to be clear about who I am and look over there and see my mom sitting there brought up some unresolved issues in me. The issue of, am I good enough? Am I clear enough? Is she here because she wants to be here, or is she just here because Margaret won't take her to the Methodist church? Is she judging me? Am I being found wanting? And it took me a while to get used to that. And then what I realized is that I needed to change my entire story about my mother. And I started to see her, probably for the very first time in my life, clearly. Now, granted, child rearing was not her genius. Think about that. And had it been more modern times, I'm not sure I would have even been able to come into this incarnation through her, because she may have chosen not to. But there were things that she was that I benefited from. And so I started to see her in a different light, to stop wanting her to be proud of me, to stop wanting her approval, and to tell me that I was a good girl. And you know, the first time she ever told me she was proud of me was in that foyer, after a talk. And she said, "You did real good, and I'm proud of you." I was like, what? Who are you? Who are you? Because I don't know who you are. You're just this nice little old lady now, and where were you back then? But back then, I couldn't have her because I was too invested in my story. I was too invested in allowing that story to define me in such a way that I didn't have to be the big me, that I could stay the little me. And when I saw her sitting there, I realized I couldn't get away from her. You know, I'm going to be standing here, especially when John was gone. You know, I'm going to be standing here and have to deal with the fact that she is listening to me put my life on the line to say what I believe and to do it in a strong and powerful way. Then I could begin to see her in a different light. And that, I think, allowed her to see me in a different light. Not as the rebellious young teenager that moved out of the house at 15, did quite the rounds with substance and all of that, but as the woman that I am today. And in changing my story about her, I got a different mother. I just want to share that with you. I think it's fantastic. Maybe your parents are not who you think they are. Maybe you think that they are maybe you think they are who you think they are because there's a payoff in there for you. And what I want you to know is that the payoff is not worth it. I believe we choose our parents. I believe I picked that woman. I believe I picked my father. I believe I picked the exact second to incarnate into planet Earth. I believe that we are powerful, creative, spiritual beings alive and well on planet Earth. And if we have set the stage for all of this, we might as well take the good out of it. So what is it that is our story? And does your story have a happy ending? Or does your story just go round and round like Catch-22? Does your story have you playing small, losing, being victimized by life? Or does your story have you gaining key ingredients that you need to be the powerful being that you are meant to be? Are you living your big story or your little story? Because everybody's got a big story and a little story. Everybody does. Look at Gandhi. Ooh, we're in the season 4, Intentional Peace. The birthdays between Gandhi and King. But look at Gandhi. He has a little story. He was educated in England and he went back to India. He bought a first-class train ticket through the post and he went to get on that train and they told him he had to go back in with, at that time they called them the colored people. And he said, no thank you, I have a ticket for a first-class seat. So they beat him up and threw him off the train. Gandhi. That's his little story. His big story is that he led an entire country to freedom from Britain. He taught the whole world how to have nonviolence and yet to win a war. That's his big story. How about Martin Luther King? He had a little story. He had to deal with a lot of prejudice in his life. He died in his 30s. He was still young. But what's his big story? His big story is that he brought this, the movement for equality full-orbed into the social eye, into our awareness. And during this time we celebrate the time between Gandhi and King as a season for intentional peace. They are changing the world even today. We have the Buddha. It's got a little story. He was born a prince. Some people think that's a pretty big story, but it's not. He was sheltered, protected from life, until one day he looked out of the palace walls and saw people were sick and hungry and dirty, and he said, what is this? And his person, his assistant, we would call it now, said, this is the way people live, and everybody's going to die, including you. He said, I can't deal with this. So what he did is he ran away from the palace, and he tried to find that peace within him. And he didn't have a good experience. This was not the Buddha under the Bodhi tree in enlightenment. He practiced he hurt himself. He starved himself. He almost killed himself. So much that he was so weak he fell into a river and almost drowned because he just couldn't get out. And in that way, a little girl offered him a bowl of rice. And he said, well, I'm going to die if I don't eat, so maybe eating a little rice isn't so bad. And he found the middle way, which is not gluttonous pleasure all the time, and it's not self-flagellation all the time. There's a middle way that we can live. And now there are so many Buddhists, and they chant the Om, and they sing the Gayatri Mantra, and they hold a vision for peace on the planet. That's his big story. Look at Jesus. Jesus didn't live past 33. He was only a carpenter's son. He worked in a carpenter's shop. They say he never got married. We're not sure. His friends turned against him. He didn't have any degrees. People got mad at him. They tried him, and they hung him up on a cross and killed him. Then he was dead. He didn't even have his own burial place. He had to be put in a borrowed tomb. That's the little story. The big story is that he fed the multitudes, he healed the sick, he caused the blind to see and the lame to walk, and he challenged social norms to such a level that he changed the consciousness. They say he ushered in the Piscean age. He changed the consciousness of planet Earth. There are over 2 billion people on the planet that claim themselves to be Christian. He changed the course of history. That's the big story. And I think every day when we look in the mirror, we get a chance to say, am I going to see the little story, or am I going to see the big story? Am I going to see this little thing that happened yesterday, that someone did me wrong, someone said something, someone took my parking place, the thing I wanted wasn't on sale, I've been done wrong, and then we get to be small and helpless? Or are we going to see the big story? Maybe I got fired yesterday. Maybe I got divorced yesterday. Maybe I went bankrupt yesterday. Maybe they're trying to tell me I got some kind of disease yesterday. But I know there is something bigger and greater within me than anything that any outside circumstance can ever reflect back to me, because I created that outside circumstance. And if I created that outside circumstance, I created it to heal and to grow and to thrive through. To thrive through. That's the big story. And whatever story you tell yourself, you're going to believe. Whatever story you tell yourself, you're going to live. So I encourage you during this time to notice the flame coming out of the book. The fire within your story. It's completely up to you. You can change your story, and you can change your life. And so it is.